But it's great to be here because this is work that's been going on for quite a few years. And this is the first opportunity I've had to bring it all together. So we've got 3 studies coming up, one on French and Arabic and 2 studies on English. And it was really great to bring this all together, but it's quite a lot. So we're talking about 12 classrooms and 3 studies. So I have a lot of material. I'm not sure we'll get to all of it. Please interrupt me as we go along with questions, because by the time we get to the end, you'll either forgotten the question or you might be asleep post snaps. But okay, let's start. So a foundation of second language acquisition is that learners need target language input and they need to be able to produce in the target language, right? These are 2 things that we know are necessary. We know this from work in the 80s with the input hypothesis, the output hypothesis, and the interaction hypothesis, all of which have been supported by empirical findings. The question that I'm interested in is how much second language, so L2 is second language input and production, is needed for optimal language acquisition. So let me ask you, I think many of you are language teachers, yes? What languages? Spanish, French,
Nepali,
Arabic,
Nepali,
German, French, okay.
Yucatec Maya.
Oh, very exotic. Okay, one of the less commonly taught languages. How much of your class do you think needs to be taught in the target language, percentage-wise? So what percentage of the interaction in your language class do you think needs to be in the target language? So Arabic or French or Spanish or German, Yucatec Mayan? Yes?
I'm learning Hebrew, so I feel that our class is about 80% Hebrew with immersion, so that's helpful for me.
Okay, so this is a great perspective. You're a learner of Hebrew and you think the current percentage, about 80%, is optimal for you. Okay? Other responses? Zadie, a good number?
I would like to believe that I'm teaching 100% in the
Okay, so that is your goal as a teacher, is to teach 100% in the target language from the beginner level all the way up. Yes?
Yes, I don't know what classroom are we talking about, because we have the physical, like 4 walls, and then the classroom outside. So we have grammar lessons outside of the classroom, explained in English, but we want them to use exclusively French in the classroom. But we also allow, when you are stuck, comment dit-on, and then you put the English word. So I don't know the percentage, but
So this is permissible to ask for a word, a translation of a word in the non-target language. Okay, good. So what you have expressed, I think, is probably the mainstream views. And what I'm doing here today is maybe challenging that view, right? Challenging that 100%, maybe even challenging the 80%, right? So that's what I'm here to do today. So a distinction here, 2 different kinds of pedagogy. We are faced with a terminological challenge here. There are lots of terms that can be used to describe what I'm talking about today. So one label is, and I'm using immersive, one label is immersive pedagogy. We can also call this target language only pedagogy, full immersion, or monolingual. Monolingual is often misunderstood. Monolingual is usually associated with first language. What I mean here is monolingual second language only in the classroom, right? Versus non-immersive pedagogy. So that's the use of the L1 or native language, or any other language actually, in the second language classroom. So basically the use of the non-target language in the second language classroom. You can call this a code switching approach, translation. Translanguaging is a huge term that's being used these days. A multilingual, plurilingual, or bilingual approach to language teaching. And these are the 2 approaches that I'm contrasting in this study across 12 classrooms. So how many of you said you have used English in your French classroom just to provide, so have you used English or just the students when they need a word?
The students.
Only the students?
Now, in difficult situations,
Yes.
yes, we try
Yes.
either to write it and not say it, or say it.
Okay. So I really enjoy your description. In difficult situations, I might resort to English, but I'm not going to say it. I'm going to write it. These are the kinds of attitudes that are commonly expressed by teachers and their employers. Absolutely what I've come across. Do you ever say English in your...
Again, depending on the situation, when I see the student eyes, they kind of glazing over or completely, not. So I think I'm gonna sense, they need a
Yeah.
explanation. Sometimes I do revert to English, but
To wake them up?
to wake them up and to really make sure they understood.
Okay. To clarify understanding. How about in Spanish?
Yeah, we don't.
No.
Very, maybe after the class, if somebody really comes and talks to you personally.
Mm-hmm.
We do that thing about writing
Mhm.
the board.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I'm obviously not a Cornell teacher, but I'm an employee of Concordia Language Villages.
Mhm.
So I've taught Arabic to younger children
Mhm.
for 2 years now. And something that they kind of force down your throats really from day one is that you don't use English. And it's very interesting to me because in villages that are Indo-European languages with high degrees of kind of cognate resemblance of English, specifically French, Spanish, and German, they are almost 100% in the target language all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But in my village, Arabic,
Mhm.
in Korean and in Japanese, it's still, I would say, probably 80% at least. But we've kind of come to the understanding as a group and as a staff that that's just not feasible for a language like Arabic, because students, when they're hearing French input or when they're hearing German input, at least especially if they're children, can pick out cognates and words that sound the same because there's so much shared vocabulary. With Arabic, that is so rare and so far between, and there's so much dialectal variation that children in particular, when they're already in a very stressful situation, which is being at camp, being away from home, they really struggle with that. And so we use English in a very limited capacity, but also very strategically.
Yep.
I think.
So this is another view that I've had, that in some of the more commonly taught languages, maybe with language distances closer to the native language, 100% target language usage, but in the less commonly taught languages or languages with greater distance, well, it's not, we have to use some English, but we don't talk about that a lot, we just do it a little bit. Yeah, absolutely. And so this project tries to address that issue too by looking at French and Arabic, right?
And if you use 100%, target language, in the class, it's really time consuming. And then, to take the one class, you might need to spend, other 3-4 hours if you want to take 1 hour class, so that's why there is another challenge also there.
For sure. And some would say, most would argue, that time is valuable time. It's negotiation of meaning, that struggle is necessary for language acquisition. So even though it takes a lot of time, that time is valuable time. Okay, so what do we know? It's interesting. There's a growing number of theoretical position statements that are arguing against an immersive pedagogy and arguing for a multilingual non-immersive pedagogy, right? Lots of position statements that have been published since the early 2000s. Translanguaging, have you heard of translanguaging? Is a movement that has just caught fire across the world, is being represented at conferences all over the place, lots and lots of presentations about translanguaging. And one definition of translanguaging is the use of an individual's full linguistic repertoire, so all the languages they know, to achieve their communicative goals, especially in the education of emergent bilinguals. So New York State is a really early mover in the translanguaging movement. We have Ophelia Garcia in New York City. She's been a really key figure in this area. Despite these empirical positions, and the translanguaging movement has really caught on in K through 12 education, especially for English as a second language. But these positions haven't really caught on everywhere, especially in higher education. So higher education appears to be quite resistant to some of these trends. And there are notes of caution, so people talking about a neoliberal agenda, and also an over-reliance, cautioning against an over-reliance on use of the native language in the second language classroom. So quite a lot of position statements arguing against an immersive pedagogy. In terms of empirical research, most of the research that has been done thus far is descriptive. We know that from lots of studies, more than are represented here, that teachers do use the first language or non-target languages in the second language classroom. They do that. They use it for different purposes. They sometimes wake students up, use it for disciplinary purposes, use it to explain complex points, interpersonal relationships, lots of different functions. In general, the use of the non-target language, the use of the first language, has been perceived positively by teachers in these research studies. But teachers also feel guilty about its use. So there's this real difficult line that they're walking. They think it's a good idea to do it, but they feel terribly guilty about it. Students, especially younger students and lower proficiency students, really appreciate use of the, say, first language in the second language classroom, although not entirely. So not all students like this, and some students have expressed maybe less than 10% of the class should be in non-target language use. We also know, though, that there are seriously negative professional consequences for teachers who are not using the target language in a second or foreign language classroom. So I have heard lots of stories from my own pre-service teachers who have told me that in their teaching context, maybe a supervisor is wandering the hallway, and if the supervisor hears the teacher not using the target language in their classroom, they might get fired. So they have that fear, right? I've heard a lot of trauma around first language usage from teachers. Oh, I want to use it, but I can't, I'm not allowed. Can you help me with this issue? Lots and lots of trauma around this issue, and trauma among teachers is another area I'm interested in, but definitely negative professional consequences for teachers. I've had supervisors call me and ask me, okay, what's the optimal percentage of target language usage? Because this teacher is using this percentage and I don't think this is right, and I'm looking to get rid of this teacher, basically. Yes?
Yes, no, you mentioned a while ago that those who are for the use of first language,
yes,
they feel bad doing that. Why? I didn't read the research.
Because of the consequences of doing so.
Oh.
So their employers are looking for teachers to be able to teach entirely in the target language. And if they're not able to do that, or there is evidence that they haven't done that, their jobs are at stake. So they think it's pedagogically right in some way to use the non-target language, but they're worried about the consequences, and so they feel guilty about that.
And also worried about the results in terms of...
Yes, for sure. They could be worried about, the student outcomes, but they have professional reasons to want to do it. The reason they want to do it is they think it's going to be effective for outcomes, right? Maybe there are teachers who are using the L1 as a crutch, maybe their own proficiency is an issue, but teachers who are completely bilingual are wanting to do this because they think it's better for the students, right? Yes?
Have you read any research, or is there any research that studies how this plays out specifically with diglossic languages and use of dialect in the classroom? If there's any kind of similar feelings of guilt, not for necessarily transitioning to the student's L1, but using a dialect that's simpler on an objective linguistic level to understand.
Actually, that's a really good question that I haven't seen anything on, but that doesn't mean there isn't anything on that. That would be a really interesting parallel to draw. So that's a great suggestion for me to look into. Yes. And we know that the use of, say, the first language in the target language classroom is moderated by things like the learner's proficiency, the extent that the teacher has second language knowledge themselves, the age of the learner, individual differences in the learner. So some learners just prefer one way or another. The type of interactions that they're engaged in, or the task type, and their learning goals. This is all descriptive research. What do teachers do? What do students do? How do they feel about it? None of this is about measuring learning outcomes, right? When we look at experimental or quasi-experimental research on learning outcomes, there is very little. So, and most of the studies I have come across are for English. So English as a foreign language or English as a second language. So we see one study that looked at improved students' perceptions of outcomes in writing and listening when the teacher and or the students are using first language in the second language classroom. Interestingly, this isn't actually an objective measure of outcomes. This is students' perceptions of outcomes. So they feel they're doing better, right? However, there's no control group in this study. A master's thesis in 2016 did have a control and experimental condition and showed improved writing outcomes with use of the first language, but only after one class period of 15 minutes. Macaro and colleagues have done quite a bit of research in this area, focused on vocabulary acquisition, and most of the research is showing that if you use the first language to convey to students the meaning of second language vocabulary, they're more likely to remember the vocabulary, at least in the short term. And then for second language, similar results here. But basically, very limited research, experimental research, and almost nothing in languages other than English, right? So this is where we're coming from. So these are the questions that these three studies are trying to address. Does quasi-experimentally manipulating use of the first language in the second language classroom have any effects on learning outcomes in the second language? And that's language learning outcomes, not other content area outcomes. Student preferences, instructor observations, and do these effects vary by language, by instructor, over time, and by proficiency level? Lots of things we're trying to do here. So this is the first study that I'm going to talk about today. It's French and Arabic. This French and Arabic has foreign languages with beginners, with 2 teachers involved in this study. And the beginner level has an asterisk here because these studies were lab studies and students signed up to participate in this research, and all of them promised that they were beginners. But then when you get to know them a little bit later, it all comes out, oh, well, actually, I studied a little bit back in, wherever, and actually my mother is, whatever. So in each class, there were a couple of learners who weren't complete beginners. For Arabic, I think 160 people tried to get into this study. We could only take 20 in each class. That was the maximum size class we could take. For French, the sign-up was a little bit less. So in the end, in our treatment class, where we were running a non-immersion pedagogy, we had 7 participants in week 1. That dropped to 6 by week 10. So these were 10-week studies. In our control class, we started with 8 participants, and that dropped to 6. So the control class was using an immersion pedagogy. In Arabic, interestingly, we started with 19, so 1 dropped before we even started. But by week 10, that had dropped to 10 in our treatment class. And then in the control class, we started with 19, and that dropped to 7. So that in and of itself, I think, is quite interesting, but I haven't looked at that further. The classes in setup were fairly similar, conducted on a university campus, but these weren't full credit classes, these were lab classes. In terms of the procedure, in the French class, some varieties of French were introduced, sometimes Canadian French. The teacher was strongly CLT oriented, so communicative language teaching, very, very strong communicative language teaching teacher. The topics that she covered were basic things that you would see in a sort of survival class, so introductions, numbers, weather, clothing, city locations and directions. Over the 10-week implementation, the students were given 2.5 hours of instruction per week, and they were told that they could only review for 2 hours during each week. So they shouldn't go and seek extra input in French. They should just review what they had studied in the class for a maximum of 2 hours. In the non-immersion treatment class, we used suggestions from Selig and Selzter, the Translanguaging guide, and employed English in some of the instructions for the activities, some of the vocabulary and grammar explanations, some cultural notes, and some side conversations. How the teacher employed English in this class was up to the teacher. So as a researcher, I did not insert myself into that. I gave the teacher options for the kinds of things she could consider and left it up to her professional judgment. I think that's the most ecologically valid way to conduct this study. In the immersion class, French was used for almost all teacher and student communication. For Arabic, this was tricky. So I really relied, I am not a speaker of either French or Arabic, just I should have had that disclaimer at the beginning. So I really relied on our teacher for guidance here. So the teacher decided we were going to cover modern standard Arabic, which is problematic for oral communication. A little Moroccan dialect was thrown in there. This teacher used some tools from communicative language teaching, but also a more academic approach. And importantly, transliteration. We did not attempt in the time available to cover reading and writing in Arabic. So we really focused on oral skills. Similar types of survival type vocabulary introduced here. Also the 10-week implementation with the same guidelines around the immersion and non-immersion conditions. This was quite sad actually, because in the very first class, the students asked me what they would be able to achieve after 22.5 hours of Arabic. And I said, okay, by the US State Department guidelines, you need, several hundred hours of Arabic instruction to attain functional proficiency. And then one of them said, will I be able to order a bowl of soup? Actually, I'm not sure that they were able to order a bowl of soup by the end, but I didn't want to demotivate them before they'd started, but it was a conversation we had to have.
The Moroccan was chosen because the teacher?
Yes. Yes. So I really relied very heavily on my teachers and their expertise. In terms of language use in the classroom, observers watched the lessons, every lesson, and estimated the ratio of target language and non-target language use per lesson segment. So, okay, here is one activity. What percentage of the time was the teacher using the target language versus the non-target language, and how about the students, right? So it's important to remember these are estimates. They are not at this point counts of words or counts by time, they're ratio estimates. And in terms of learning outcomes, we looked at weekly quiz scores, a mid-course review quiz, an end-of-course review quiz, and importantly, French and Arabic were not compared directly, right? Just the treatment and control within each language. Okay, so let's look at the results. Now first, these results are the ratio estimates of language use by teachers and students in the classroom. Red here indicates target language usage. In this case, it's French. So on the right side, these first 10 bars, you can see higher red bars. This was the immersion condition. So you can see towards the end of the course, the entire class was being conducted 100% in French, right? On the other side, you can see a lot of blue. This reflects that quite a lot of the class, teacher and student, was being conducted in English. looking specifically at two classes in week 2 and week 9, you can see some variation in those weeks, and you can also see variation by teacher and student. So in the immersion class in week 2, the teacher's production, about 80% was in French, 99% of student production was in French. Students weren't saying a lot in week 2. They weren't actually producing a lot of language in week 2. In the non-immersion class, so this is where English was being used, the teacher was using a little bit more English, but actually not a lot more. There's not a lot of difference there. But the students were using a lot more English and a lot less French in that non-immersion condition. By week 9, the teacher and students, as noted, were at 100% of French production in the immersion setting, and then in the non-immersion setting it was about half and half, right? So this really demonstrates fidelity to condition, right? We know from these measurements that the conditions that we implemented were being met by the teachers and the students. So, and in Arabic, a comparable graph here. Again, immersion is on the left, non-immersion is on the right. You can see more blue on the right, but you can also see quite a lot of blue in the immersion condition. So it was not the case in the immersion condition in Arabic, to speak to your point that you raised initially, that 100% of the class was being conducted in Arabic. Looking at teachers and students, in the immersion setting in week 2, the teacher was using 88% Arabic. In week 9, 94% Arabic, so that's pretty high. But the students were around the 50s, right? So the teacher was really trying to use Arabic as much as they could. But what is really striking for me is in week 9, the teacher's production in Arabic, in the Arabic foreign language classroom, was 23%. That's not a lot. Okay, great actually from my study, because this is not a lot of input in Arabic, right? Yes?
How is this measured? How is the use?
And this is a current weakness of the analysis. It's measured by ratio estimates. So an observer would look at each lesson segment. So for example, the warm-up. Okay, and estimate approximately what percentage of language produced by the teacher was in the target language, right? It takes a really long time and a lot of money to transcribe these lessons. I've had weeks 2 and week 9. Oh, I've had 1 lesson transcribed. So in the end, what I would like to do is count the words and do a much more accurate validation. But at this point, what we have is the ratio estimates.
So you sorry, go ahead. You were both having an observer as well as recording?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the recordings allow us to go back to check what students were actually doing and transcribe. The only way is to transcribe it. You can imagine with 19 students and multiple conversations going on, a recording devices, that's a lot of transcription. So it's going to take quite a long time to get that, and quite a lot of financial resources to get those transcribed. Yes?
So what basis, you create those group, control group and experimental group, you do something, particular type of sampling or just whatever you have?
So kind of convenient sampling, not strictly random assignment. One class was held on one day and the other class was held on the other day. Students signed up by availability.
It's really challenging for the random sampling, right?
Yeah. We tried to have 2 classes a week. Students couldn't do it. So they could only do 1 2.5 hour class. These were lab classes offered in the summer. So people start out with great goals and then they go on vacation. So that's what happened. So convenient sampling. So what I'm going to try to do is skip through the second study so you can see why I went on to study this, but to show you that the picture for Arabic is similar to the picture for French, with the non-immersion group outperforming the immersion group. Yes. So what I didn't do in this study, I didn't look at second languages, I didn't look at different proficiencies, I didn't look within a teacher, and I didn't look at additional types of analyses. So that's what I tried to do in the second study, and that came out this year in TESOL Quarterly. This was English as a second language with low and high intermediate learners with one teacher, the same teacher. So here we have 4 different classrooms, 2 at the low intermediate, 2 at the high intermediate. 1 of each of these was a control group, 1 was an experimental group, just like in the previous study, and 1 researcher practitioner. The majority of these students were Chinese, and there were singletons in other languages, which is important from a pedagogical perspective when you're using the first language in the second language classroom. If there's only 1 Indonesian speaker in that class, right, that raises a challenge. In this procedure, in the immersive approach, an English-only policy was in the syllabus, and students were reminded to use English only. Obviously, the teacher here is a second language teacher, doesn't know the first language of the student, so the teacher is not going to be using Chinese, right? But in the immersion, in the non-immersion setting, will allow the students to make that choice themselves, right? So giving students agency in their language choice for in-class discussion work or pre-writing preparatory homework. But importantly, all the assignments they produced in both of these classes were in English. There is no mechanism for submitting assignments in the 2 languages. And I think, so we have things like genre-based paragraphs and exams, genre-based essays and speaking tasks. So more, I think, thorough, deeper analyses here. And some qualitative data as well, looking at teacher and student preferences. Here, again, that red bar is the treatment group. So for the most part, the non-immersion class is outperforming the immersion class at the low intermediate level in paragraph writing across genres. In tests, they were the same and quite high, which is not surprising because these are progress tests. For high intermediate scores in paragraph, almost the same, but this is striking. In that class, I don't know, a percentage of the time, the conversations were going on in Chinese, not English. Or at home, the preparatory homework was being done in Chinese, not English, right? So the fact that these are almost the same is already striking, given that we all think immersion is the best thing. And oops, the speaking scores, very similar. This is the first speaking score, and by the end they were the same. No statistical differences here, actually. So contrary to the French and Arabic, where there were statistical differences, there were no statistical differences between the groups in the English study, first English study, and final course grades. What we did find statistical differences in were student attitudes. So for the most part, students in the non-immersion class rated their classes more positively than students in the immersion class. And statistically so in some cases. So the student said, my instructor encourages students to contribute to discussions and ask questions. If the students were in the non-immersion setting, they felt more strongly about this statement. And also, I am better able to read a variety of material. If they were in the non-immersion setting, they felt more able to read a variety of material. So this is self-perceptions of outcomes. So, you know, as a conclusion of this study, we don't see that English only is having an advantage for overall performance in paragraph writing at the low intermediate level, exams at the low intermediate level, extended writing at the high intermediate level, presentational speaking at the high intermediate level, and overall course performance. Non-immersion has a possible advantage for learner perceptions of the class, though. However, additional research was still necessary. So what I really wanted to tap into, until now, I've had one class as the treatment class and one class as the control class. These are different people. And extraneous variables could be causing the difference. So what about if we look at the same group of people and we switch the conditions and see what they think about that, right? So that's where I went next. So in the final study, again, it's English as a second language. This time it's intermediate level. So previously it was B1 and C1. Are you familiar with the CFR proficiency? So B1 and C1. This is B2. 2 teachers this time, and within students. This was a super complicated study. In 2 of the classes were highly diverse, culturally and linguistically. 2 of the classes were less diverse, majority Chinese, Mandarin speakers. And what we did here was, for 2 of the groups, for the first half of the 4 months, so for 2 months, they started off in the treatment condition, which was non-immersive, multilingual. And for the other 2 groups, so no English only, given language choice. For the other 2 groups, they started off in the control condition, English only, and English only for all kinds of activities. And then 2 months in, the groups switched, right? So from an ethical perspective, this is what institutional review boards want to see. They don't want to see treatment withheld from a group of students. They want all students to experience everything. So from an ethical perspective, this is kind of great. Really, the IRB was very happy with this. And both teachers kept journals over that 4-month period. And student practices and attitudes were surveyed at the end. So this is kind of the largest study we did. Here you can see all the different types of data points we have. So response papers, source-based papers, genre analysis, argumentative synthesis papers, narrative papers, oral presentations, homework blogs, interim and final grades, and the survey. This was all quantitative data. We also had qualitative data from the journals and qualitative comments on student surveys. All right, so I don't know, my eyes go crossed when I look at this graph. I tried to keep red for the non-immersion setting, but halfway through the semester, it switches, right? The bottom line here is there's no statistical difference. There are a few descriptive differences here and there, but there's no statistical difference in any of these measures throughout the semester between the 2 conditions. For instructor 1, and for instructor 2, same picture. What was quite interesting here, though, was student commentary on the survey. So, and this is quite interesting from a methodological perspective on self-reporting. So the students underreported their own language usage. The teacher heard them speak Korean and Portuguese, but they didn't report that they spoke Korean and Portuguese. But the teacher heard them and noted it on the relevant day in their journal, so we knew that they did. The students also said, only 39% of the students said that English only was used at some point in their class, and actually English only was used at some point in all of the classes. So I think this was underreported, but I have a question mark here, because maybe even though the teacher said it's English only, the students are doing whatever they want, right? So it's possible that that's happening. Only 65% recognized that there was a policy at some point, and so this is underreported, and 28% said there was no English only policy, so this is not accurate either. Their ideas towards their attitudes towards an English only policy, I'm not going to read these, but these are excerpts from the surveys. They said that English only was helpful in general, good for cross-cultural conversations, and good for thinking, good for processing to maintain English only. Some students said that it was necessary, but some students said it was not necessary, and some students said it was not helpful to have an English only policy. In terms of L1 use in their English class, they also said it's helpful, so one said it's great. They feel more comfortable, and it's good for self-expression. But other students said it's not necessary, it's not helpful, or it's unfair. So these are important considerations we need to take in, keep in mind, right? Not all students agree with L1 use in the class. And I'm not going to go through this data either, but the researcher practitioner journals was also qualitatively coded, and they commented on how they encouraged L1 use, how much L1 use they used, and how much L1 use there was, how they had to mandate English L2 use, and how much L2 only use there was, how they assessed students in the immersive and non-immersive group, so what observations they had about the students. So they tended to say things like, for the non-immersive group, the responses were richer and maybe more accurate in some cases. And then they made some pedagogical commentary as well. And I'd be happy to go back to this data if we're interested. So to summarize this study then, again, it seems that English only has no advantage for writing across genres at a B2 level, across 2 teachers, and across cultural and L1 differences within classes. So two of the groups were highly multilingual and multicultural. And 2 of the groups were more homogeneous. Same finding. In terms of student practices, students partially misreported their own language practices, which I think is methodologically interesting. In terms of student attitudes, there were important negative attitudes expressed, which we have to keep in mind, but the majority were positive if you look at the whole array. And those were seen in their comfort level and the facility with which they could develop ideas. And then the researcher practitioner said that the non-immersion conditions could possibly yield richer discussion and maybe faster completion of tasks. But this was the teacher's perception. It hasn't been objectively measured. So where are we? Well, there are a lot of limitations to this study. We had a lot of people drop out of the French and Arabic, especially the Arabic study, so that's problematic. The analyses are not sufficient. They are restricted to weekly quiz scores. This is quite superficial, right? So this is our first step. And we only have 22 and a half hours of instruction. In terms of the English, we do have to worry about whether the control condition was really controlled. The teacher couldn't use the L1 because they don't know the L1. The teacher encouraged the students to use English only, but the students sometimes didn't, right? So was there sufficient differentiation in the conditions? And in some cases, especially in study 2, there was a lack of L1 diversity in the classes. In study 3, we do see a ceiling effect on assignment scores, so really teasing apart differences is quite hard. And in all studies, in the treatment condition, we're allowing multilingual production, but we're testing monolingually. This is problematic. So we're testing only in French, only in Arabic, or only in English, right? We're not allowing translingual assessment. But, in the last 2 slides here, non-immersion, translanguaging, use of L1, multilingual approaches may yield higher learning outcomes, may yield more student comfort, may yield effective self-expression, faster task completion. These findings from all 12 classrooms are broadly in line with one another. So, across foreign and second languages, across more and less commonly taught languages, across different proficiency levels, across different teachers. These findings are in line with those theoretical position statements that we showed at the beginning and the descriptive findings in English as a foreign and second language and the limited experimental findings we have. But lots more research is needed. So specifically, I'm interested in the agent of language change. So who is making the switch, the teacher or the student, and why are they doing that? When the teacher or student makes a switch, how is that related to the outcome, the learning outcome, right? So what is an effective switch? And if a learner feels that they prefer one pedagogy do they have better outcomes because of that? So linking student attitudes to performance. These are all further analyses we can do with some of this data. So what's the take home for teachers? The take home is, it is probably a good idea to demonstrate your ability to teach entirely in the target language. Employers typically look for this. Students often look for this. Parents of students often look for this, right? It's probably a good idea to show that you can do this. And this is what I tell my own students who are pre-service teachers. But I do encourage opening conversations with stakeholders about whether it's necessary or even the most effective approach to do this. I hope this research breaks down some of the barriers, some of the trauma around this question, and encourages more research on this issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Amanda. We're a little bit over time here, but we started late, so sorry for the technological issues that we had. If you have any questions, please feel free to stick around, talk to Amanda, help yourselves to more food and drink. And I think we'll move the discussion offline so our people on Zoom can go about their day. So please help me again in thanking Amanda for this very interesting.
Thank you for your questions. They're really, really, really great questions that help move the work forward.